In the spring of 1889, miners working a remote claim in the mountains near Billings, Montana, accidentally broke through a concealed cave wall and discovered something that would be systematically erased from historical records. Inside a vast cavern sat the mummified remains of a man nearly 9 feet tall, preserved by the mountain's dry, cold air for what appeared to be thousands of years. He wore clothing made from animal hides, unlike any known species, ornaments crafted from pure gold, and tattoos depicting lightning bolts across his massive chest. Around him lay evidence of a sophisticated culture that had mastered high-altitude survival, built elaborate stone structures, and practiced astronomical observations that rivaled ancient civilizations. Local newspapers briefly covered the Montana mountain giant before the stories abruptly stopped. Within a year, the cave had been dynamited shut, the skeleton had vanished into an unmarked crate, and witnesses were pressured to recant their testimony. Now, over a century later, DNA fragments recovered from the site are finally revealing who these mountain giants were, how they survived in one of North America's harshest environments, and why powerful institutions wanted them forgotten. The spring of 1889 brought renewed mining activity to the mountains of central Montana. The territory had recently become a state, and the mining boom that had started with gold was expanding into copper, silver, and other valuable minerals. Claims that had been considered too remote or difficult were now attracting investment and labor as easier deposits played out. Marcus Sullivan and his partner Thomas Wilson held a claim in a particularly challenging area, a steep mountainside approximately 40 miles from Billings, at an elevation exceeding 8,000 feet. The location's remoteness had kept other miners away, but Sullivan believed he'd identified promising mineral deposits in the exposed rock faces. On April 23, 1889, while excavating a horizontal shaft following a promising quartz vein, Wilson's pickaxe broke through into empty space. The tool disappeared into darkness, followed by a rush of cold air that extinguished their lamps. After relighting and carefully widening the opening, they discovered they'd broken into a large natural cave that showed clear signs of human occupation. The cave extended deep into the mountain, its entrance having been deliberately concealed centuries earlier by a stone wall that matched the surrounding rock face. Inside, the air was remarkably dry, despite the elevation, and the temperature remained constant, cold enough to preserve organic materials, but not freezing. The conditions had created a natural preservation environment, similar to the famous Egyptian tombs, but achieved through altitude and climate rather than deliberate mummification. As their eyes adjusted to the lamplight, Sullivan and Wilson saw what appeared to be a dwelling. Not a crude shelter, but an organized living space, with stone furniture, storage areas carved into the walls, and a central fire pit. The scale was immediately unsettling. The stone seats were massive, the doorways between chambers were 10 feet high, and everything suggested inhabitants far larger than normal humans. In a chamber at the rear of the cave complex, they found him, a seated figure, back against the cave wall, legs extended, arms resting on his knees. The body had naturally mummified, the skin dried to leather but intact, preserving his appearance with eerie clarity. Even seated, his size was obvious. When they carefully measured him later, they estimated his standing height at approximately 9 feet, with proportional build suggesting weight exceeding 400 pounds when alive. His clothing consisted of expertly tanned hides from animals they couldn't identify. The fur pattern and hide thickness didn't match known North American species. A vest-like garment bore intricate quill work in geometric patterns, demonstrating sophisticated decorative traditions. Around his neck hung a necklace of what appeared to be pure gold medallions, shaped like stylized eagles or thunderbirds. Most striking were his tattoos. Despite the skin's desiccation, Clear blue-black patterns were visible across his chest and arms. Lightning bolt designs, spiral patterns, and symbols that might have represented stars or celestial bodies. The tattoo's precision indicated sophisticated artistic traditions and considerable pain tolerance during their application. Sullivan and Wilson spent 2 days exploring and documenting the cave before reporting their discovery. They found additional chambers containing what appeared to be food storage, a workshop area with stone tools of unusual size and sophistication, and, most remarkably, a chamber whose ceiling had been painstakingly carved with star patterns that matched actual constellations visible from that latitude. The items they found suggested a culture with considerable technological sophistication. Stone tools showed expert knapping and polishing techniques. Woven baskets, though brittle with age, demonstrated complex textile skills. Most intriguingly, they found implements made from metal. Not iron, but an alloy they couldn't identify that showed no signs of corrosion despite apparent antiquity. Understanding the discovery's significance, Sullivan rode to Billings to report it to authorities and local newspapers. The Billings Gazette published a detailed account on April 27, 1889, under the headline, "Ancient Giant Found in Mountain Cave. Evidence of Lost Race in Montana Territory." The article included measurements, descriptions, and Sullivan's testimony about the cave's contents. The story was picked up by other regional papers. For 2 weeks, the Montana Mountain Giant was a sensation. Scholars from Eastern universities wrote, expressing interest in examining the remains. The Smithsonian Institution sent inquiries. Then, abruptly, the coverage stopped. The Billings Gazette published a brief retraction, claiming the original story had been exaggerated. Sullivan and Wilson found themselves visited by men who strongly suggested they stop discussing their discovery. Understanding how the Montana mountain giants survived required reconstructing the challenges of their environment. At over 8,000 feet elevation, in a region experiencing extreme temperature swings, they faced conditions that would kill unprepared humans within hours during winter. The cave system they'd adapted for habitation showed sophisticated understanding of environmental management. The main living chamber was positioned to capture morning sunlight through a carefully positioned opening, providing natural warming during the coldest hours. A complex series of smaller openings created controlled airflow that prevented carbon monoxide buildup from fires while minimizing heat loss, essentially a natural ventilation system requiring deep understanding of air currents and pressure. The stone furniture found in the cave wasn't crude, but carefully shaped for comfort and function. Stone seats were smoothed and angled to support the body properly. Stone tables showed wear patterns indicating regular use. Most remarkably, several chambers contained stone beds, flat surfaces with carved channels along the sides that might have held bedding materials, elevated slightly to prevent ground cold from reaching sleepers. Fire management was crucial for survival. The giants had used animal fat for fuel, burning it in stone lamps that provided both light and heat with minimal smoke. Analysis of soot deposits on cave ceilings showed they'd burned rendered fat, possibly from mountain goats or similar animals, in carefully designed stone vessels that maximized burning efficiency while minimizing air pollution. Their bodies showed adaptations to high-altitude life. Forensic analysis conducted decades later on bone fragments suggested enlarged lung capacity relative to body size, an adaptation that would have improved oxygen uptake in thin air. Their barrel-shaped chests and wide nasal passages would have helped them breathe efficiently in an environment where normal humans struggled. The isolation of their existence was nearly total. The cave's location was so remote and the entrance so carefully concealed that other peoples probably never knew they existed. This isolation might have been deliberate, a people who'd learned that contact with others brought conflict, choosing instead to live hidden in the mountains, where their exceptional size and strength allowed survival despite the harsh conditions. Food storage areas showed sophisticated preservation techniques. Some chambers maintained temperatures just above freezing year-round, functioning as natural refrigeration. Dried meat found in storage showed it had been treated with salt and herbs, preservation methods that extended shelf life significantly. Root vegetables had been stored in sand-filled stone containers that prevented moisture loss while discouraging rot. Water management demonstrated engineering knowledge. A system of stone channels directed water from a mountain spring deeper in the cave system into a collection pool in the living areas. The channels were angled precisely to maintain flow without freezing, and the pool was deep enough that surface ice wouldn't block access to liquid water beneath. This system provided reliable water access even during severe winter, when surface sources would be frozen solid. The giants' hunting strategies adapted to their environment and physical capabilities. Evidence suggested they could run at altitude with endurance that would have been impossible for normal humans. Their strength allowed use of massive stone-pointed spears that could bring down large game with single strikes. Rather than elaborate pursuit techniques, they apparently relied on physical prowess, running down prey through sheer stamina or positioning themselves to ambush game trails with weapons that could kill through massive trauma. Their relationship with the mountain environment was intimate and sustainable. They took only what they needed, wasted nothing, and left minimal impact on the landscape. This conservation ethic might have been practical necessity. At such elevation, resources were limited and renewal was slow. Overexploitation would have meant starvation. The clothing found preserved in the cave demonstrated mastery of leather working. Hides had been tanned using methods that rendered them supple yet durable. Some garments showed decorative quill work and possibly early beadwork, suggesting artistic traditions despite their isolation. The preservation of clothing indicated the dry cave environment and perhaps deliberate storage practices that protected valuable items between seasons. The most remarkable feature of the Montana Mountain Giants cave was the astronomical chamber, a space whose ceiling had been painstakingly carved with representations of stars, constellations, and celestial patterns that demonstrated sophisticated astronomical knowledge and possibly deep spiritual beliefs connecting these mountain dwellers to the heavens. The star map carved into the cave ceiling wasn't crude or approximate, but showed detailed accuracy. Recognizable constellations were positioned correctly relative to each other, with individual stars sized according to their apparent brightness. The Big Dipper, Orion's Belt, and other prominent features were clearly identifiable. More remarkably, the map appeared to show the night sky as it would have appeared thousands of years earlier, accounting for precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that gradually shifts the apparent position of stars over millennia. Creating such a map required not just casual observation, but systematic recording over extended periods. Someone had tracked stellar positions, noted seasonal changes, and translated three-dimensional observations onto a two-dimensional ceiling in ways that preserved spatial relationships. This achievement suggested either a single, dedicated observer working over a lifetime or accumulated knowledge passed across generations. The purpose of this astronomical knowledge was likely both practical and spiritual. Practically, understanding stellar movements allowed timekeeping, seasonal prediction, and possibly navigation during their rare ventures away from the mountain. Spiritually, the careful attention to celestial patterns suggested they saw significance beyond mere utility. Indigenous accounts from Crow and Blackfoot peoples preserved stories about the tall ones who came from the sky, or people who lived on mountains touching clouds. While such stories are often dismissed as mythology, their consistency across different tribes and specific details about mountain-dwelling giants suggest they might preserve genuine cultural memory of contact with the Montana mountain giants. The giants apparently believed their ancestors had descended from the stars or been sent by celestial beings. This belief system is common across many ancient cultures. The notion that humanity's origins, or at least certain special lineages, traced to the heavens. Whether this represented genuine historical memory of ancient migrations, metaphorical thinking about origins, or pure spiritual belief, remains unknowable. Religious practices apparently centered on celestial events. Solar eclipses held particular significance. Evidence suggested they conducted ceremonies involving the sacrifice of mountain sheep or goats during such events. Lunar cycles also mattered, with certain phases marked by ritual activities whose exact nature could only be inferred from artifacts and spatial arrangements in ceremonial areas. The use of quartz crystals in ritual contexts appeared throughout the cave. Quartz pieces, some natural and others deliberately shaped, were found in arrangements suggesting ritual significance. Many ancient cultures attributed spiritual properties to quartz due to its clarity, hardness, and piezoelectric properties, the ability to generate small electrical charges when compressed. Whether the giants understood the physics or simply recognized that quartz seemed special, they clearly valued it. Wind patterns through the mountain received spiritual interpretation. The cave's ventilation system created distinctive sounds when wind passed through, low, moaning tones that varied with wind speed and direction. The giants apparently interpreted these sounds as messages or warnings from spiritual entities, possibly ancestors or sky beings they believed watched over them. Death rituals involved covering the deceased's eyes with flat stones, a practice found across many cultures, but implemented here with characteristic scale. The stones used were often quartz or other special minerals, carefully selected and shaped. This practice might have represented beliefs about the journey after death, preventing the deceased from seeing back into the living world, or perhaps helping them see into the next realm. The seated position of the discovered giant suggested he'd either died that way or been positioned post-mortem for spiritual reasons. Many cultures position the dead in ways reflecting beliefs about the afterlife. Seated might indicate readiness to rise again, a posture of meditation or contemplation appropriate for the journey ahead, or simply practical considerations about burial space. The Montana mountain giant's clothing, ornaments, and personal items revealed a culture that, despite isolation, had developed sophisticated material traditions and artistic expression that marked both practical adaptations to their environment and spiritual beliefs about identity and status. The primary garment found on the giant was constructed from hides that puzzled zoologists when examined decades later. The fur pattern and hide characteristics didn't match any known North American mammal. Not bear, not mountain lion, not elk or moose. One possibility is that the hides came from species that went extinct during the giant's era, possibly hunted to extinction by changing climate or the giants themselves. Another is that they traded with distant peoples for exotic materials, though their isolation makes this less likely. The tanning process used on the hides was extraordinarily effective. Despite centuries of aging, the leather remained supple rather than becoming brittle. Chemical analysis suggested treatment with a complex mixture of brain tissue, smoke, and possibly other organic compounds that modern leather workers recognize as sophisticated preservation techniques. The giants had mastered leather chemistry through experimentation and tradition. Most spectacular was the headdress or crown found near the giant's seated body. Constructed from what appeared to be pure gold, it featured stylized representations of eagles or thunderbirds, birds associated with power, storms, and celestial realms across many Native American cultures. The craftsmanship was exceptional. The gold had been worked with tools and techniques that produced clean lines and smooth surfaces. Either the giants had goldsmithing capabilities, or they'd acquired this item through trade, which seems less likely given their isolation. Ear ornaments consisted of what Sullivan and Wilson described as strange metal that doesn't rust or tarnish. When fragments were eventually analyzed, They proved to be an alloy whose composition didn't match any traditional metalworking. The metal remained bright and uncorroded despite being centuries old, suggesting either an alloy composition that naturally resisted oxidation or some protective treatment whose nature remains mysterious. Tattoos covering the giant's torso and arms depicted lightning bolts, symbols of power, storms, and divine force. The precision of the tattooing suggested skilled practitioners who could create straight lines and consistent patterns despite the pain involved. The pigment used was carbon-based, probably derived from soot or charcoal, and had penetrated deeply enough to remain visible despite skin desiccation. Hair decoration involved the insertion of small carved antler pieces directly into the hair, creating a distinctive appearance. The antler pieces were shaped into points or small decorative forms, and apparently attached in ways that allowed them to remain in place. This practice might have held spiritual significance, deer and elk antlers symbolizing strength, renewal, or connection to the animal world. Footwear preserved in the cave showed the giants wore substantial boots constructed from multiple layers of hide. The soles were particularly thick and had been studded with small stone pieces that provided traction on icy or rocky surfaces, essentially primitive crampons that would have aided movement on the steep mountain terrain around their cave. The boots' size alone was remarkable, measuring over 20 inches long and proportionally wide. A medicine bag or personal pouch found near the giant contained items whose significance was both practical and possibly spiritual. These included small carved stones, dried plant materials that might have been medicinal herbs, and several pieces of the mysterious, non-corroding metal. The bag itself was decorated with geometric beadwork in patterns that might have held symbolic meaning. Body decoration extended beyond tattoos to scarification, deliberate scarring that created raised patterns on the skin. While less visible than tattoos after mummification, careful examination revealed pattern scarring on the giant's shoulders and upper arms. Many cultures used scarification to mark important life events, status achievements, or spiritual initiations. The overall impression from the giant's attire and decoration was of someone who held high status within his culture. The gold ornaments, sophisticated clothing, and elaborate body decoration suggested either a leader, a spiritual figure, or a warrior of exceptional accomplishment. He wasn't simply a random member of his people, but someone important enough to justify such investment in personal adornment. The Montana mountain giants' position at the top of their local food chain was evident from the weapons, hunting tools, and food remains found in the cave. These weren't passive dwellers, but active predators who used their size, strength, and intelligence to dominate their environment in ways that would have been impossible for normal-sized humans. The primary weapons were massive stone-pointed spears, far too large and heavy for normal humans to throw effectively. The spear points measured 8 to 10 inches long, napped from obsidian or high-quality flint with expert skill. The hafting that attached points to wooden shafts used bindings of sinew so tight that remained intact despite centuries of drying. These weren't throwing spears, but thrusting weapons, requiring the hunter to close with prey and use tremendous strength to drive the point through hide and into vital organs. Stone clubs or hammers found in the cave weighed 15 to 20 pounds, weapons that would exhaust a normal person after a few swings, but which the giants could wield effectively. These weapons would have been devastating against large game or potential enemies. A single strike could shatter bone or crush skulls, making the giants formidable even against dangerous prey like grizzly bears that might dispute territory. Evidence of their hunting strategies came from bone deposits in the cave. Bison bones were common, showing the giants hunted these large herbivores despite the challenge they represented. But unlike normal hunters who used elaborate drives or traps, the giants apparently hunted more directly, possibly running down prey through endurance, or using their size advantage to intimidate herds and single out vulnerable individuals. Mountain goat and bighorn sheep remains showed the giants hunted in their high-altitude environment. These animals are exceptionally difficult to hunt. They inhabit steep, dangerous terrain where pursuit is treacherous. But the giants' size and strength would have been advantages in such terrain. Their long legs could cover rough ground efficiently, and their strength allowed them to navigate slopes that would challenge smaller hunters. Their diet was heavily meat-based, a necessity in their high-altitude environment where plant foods were scarce and seasonal. Bone analysis from fragments eventually recovered showed they consumed large quantities of animal protein, fat, and bone marrow. This carnivorous diet would have provided the calories necessary to maintain their large bodies in a cold environment where energy expenditure was high. Plant foods supplemented their meat diet seasonally. Evidence of root vegetables, berries, and edible plants showed they knew which mountain flora was safe and nutritious. Some storage areas contained dried berries and what might have been pine nuts, foods that could be gathered during brief mountain summers and stored for winter consumption. The natural food storage capabilities of certain cave chambers allowed the giants to maintain supplies year-round. Meat could be preserved through drying and cold storage, allowing them to hunt when conditions were favorable and maintain reserves for harsh winter months when hunting would be difficult or impossible. Their movement through the mountains was efficient despite their size. Evidence suggests they could travel considerable distances, following game migrations and possibly visiting other cave systems or hunting areas. Their strength and endurance made them capable of multi-day expeditions, carrying substantial loads of meat back to their primary dwelling. The relationship between altitude and their survival was crucial. At elevation, they faced less competition from other peoples. Normal humans struggled at such heights, experiencing altitude sickness and reduced physical capacity. But the giants' apparent physiological adaptations allowed them to thrive where others merely survived. This altitude gave them a refuge where their exceptional size and strength translated into effective dominance of available resources. Freedom in their mountain environment meant something different than it would in more populated areas. They weren't free to travel widely or interact with diverse peoples, but within their mountain realm, they lived according to their own patterns, answerable to no authority but natural forces and their own social structures. This isolation preserved their unique culture, but also made them vulnerable. When circumstances changed or outside pressures mounted, they had nowhere to retreat. The Montana mountain giants demonstrated engineering capabilities that challenged assumptions about what primitive peoples could achieve with Stone Age technology. The structures and modifications they'd created in and around their cave dwelling showed sophisticated understanding of materials, forces, and construction principles. The most impressive feature was a massive stairway carved directly into the mountain face, allowing access from lower elevations to their high-altitude cave. The steps were enormous, each riser approximately 18 inches high, cut into solid granite through patient grinding and percussion. The stairway extended over 100 vertical feet, representing thousands of hours of labor. Its surface had been smoothed enough to prevent slipping, and the edges showed rounding from what must have been centuries of use. At the cave entrance, a massive stone door had been carved to fit precisely into the opening. This door, a single slab of granite weighing an estimated 3 tons, could be moved by pushing from inside despite its weight. The giants had achieved this through careful engineering. The door's bottom edge rested in a carved groove that acted as a track. Its sides fitted into carved channels that guided its movement. The door's center of gravity was positioned so that relatively modest force could slide it, using mechanical advantage principles that required sophisticated understanding. Water management within the cave system demonstrated hydraulic engineering knowledge. Channels carved into stone floors directed water from a spring deep in the mountain to various chambers. The channels were precisely angled to maintain steady flow without erosion or overflow. Collection pools were carved with overflow passages that prevented flooding while maintaining reservoir depth. The system provided fresh water year-round despite external temperatures that would freeze surface sources. Stone tools found throughout the cave showed exceptional craftsmanship. Many had been polished to glass-like smoothness, not just for aesthetic reasons, but because polished stone tools maintain sharper edges and are more durable. Achieving such polish required specialized abrasive techniques, probably using sand and water over thousands of repetitive motions. The time investment indicated these tools were valued possessions, maintained and improved over long periods. Most mysterious were the cave paintings found in several chambers. These depicted large birds or flying creatures that the giants apparently rode, or believed they could ride. The creatures were rendered with anatomical detail, suggesting observation of real animals, yet no known species matched the depicted size and form. Whether these represented extinct species, mythological beings, or symbolic representations of spiritual beliefs remained uncertain. The internal chamber divisions showed spatial planning and stoneworking skill. Walls between chambers had been created by stacking stones without mortar in patterns that remained stable through precise fitting and weight distribution. Some walls incorporated natural cave features, using existing stone formations as structural elements. The result was a cave dwelling, with defined spaces for different activities: sleeping, food preparation, tool making, ceremonial practices. Storage niches had been carved into walls at various heights. These niches held possessions, food stores, and sacred objects, keeping them organized and accessible. The niche's positioning suggested the giants had systematic organization, with different types of items stored in specific locations according to some classification system that made sense within their culture. Central chamber ceiling heights exceeded 10 feet, accommodating the giants' size while allowing heat from fires to rise and circulate before exiting through ventilation passages. This thermal management showed understanding of convection and heat movement, practical physics applied through observation and experimentation rather than theoretical knowledge. The sophistication of their construction suggested the cave dwelling was not a single generation's work, but accumulated improvements over long occupation. Each generation probably added refinements, carved new features, and improved existing structures based on experience. This continuity implied stable occupation over considerable time, perhaps centuries or longer. Within months of the Montana mountain giants' discovery becoming public, a systematic effort began to suppress information and eliminate evidence. Understanding this erasure requires examining the social and institutional contexts of 1889 America and the interests threatened by evidence of ancient giants. In late 1889, men identified only as representatives of Eastern scientific institutions arrived in the Billings area inquiring about the discovery. They met privately with Sullivan and Wilson, offering to purchase the rights to excavate and study the cave. The terms seemed generous, but included requirements that the miners sign agreements preventing them from discussing the discovery or entering the cave during the investigation. Sullivan and Wilson, needing money and believing scientific study would validate their discovery, agreed. The Eastern representatives, who contemporary accounts suggest were connected to either the Smithsonian Institution or wealthy private collectors, took possession of the site in early 1890. They brought equipment and workers, spending several months excavating and removing materials from the cave. Local residents who observed the operation noted that materials were packed into unmarked wooden crates and shipped east via rail. The giant's body was reportedly dismantled, not carefully preserved, but rather rudely separated into parts that were individually packed. Witnesses reported seeing crates labeled only with numbers, nothing identifying their extraordinary contents. In the spring of 1890, after removing everything of value or interest, the Eastern representatives used dynamite to collapse the cave entrance. They claimed this was necessary to prevent looting or damage to what remained, but the explosive charges were excessive. Witnesses reported that the blasts not only closed the entrance, but destabilized the entire area, causing a section of the mountainside to slide and bury the location beneath tons of rock and debris. The official explanation given to local authorities was that the cave had been found to contain nothing of scientific value, just a random oddity of no importance. This explanation contradicted everything Sullivan and Wilson had seen and what newspapers had initially reported. When they objected, they were reminded of the agreements they'd signed and threatened with legal action if they continued making unfounded claims. The Billings Gazette and other newspapers that had covered the discovery published retractions, status that initial reports had been exaggerated, and that expert examination had shown the remains were not as remarkable as first believed. These retractions appeared almost simultaneously across multiple papers, suggesting coordinated pressure from powerful interests. Sullivan and Wilson attempted to fight back, writing letters to newspapers and government officials insisting on the truth. Their letters were either ignored or published with editorial notes suggesting they'd been deceived or were perpetrating a hoax. Eventually, facing social pressure and legal threats, they stopped their public campaign. Thomas Wilson reportedly became increasingly bitter, maintaining until his death in 1923 that he'd seen what he'd seen, and that powerful forces had stolen and hidden evidence that would change historical understanding. Museum records in Montana showed no accession of giant remains or materials from the cave. Inquiries sent to Eastern institutions received no acknowledgement, or were met with denials that such materials had been received. The physical evidence had apparently vanished into private collections or institutional storage so deep that even staff didn't know what was hidden in their facilities. The most damning evidence of deliberate suppression came from private correspondence discovered decades later. Letters between officials discussed the need to properly contextualize discoveries that might confuse public understanding or support unscientific narratives. While never explicitly stating what should be hidden, the letters made clear that certain discoveries were seen as problematic and needed careful management. Photographs taken by Sullivan and Wilson reportedly documented the giant and cave interior. These photographs were allegedly seized during the Eastern investigation and never returned. No copies survived, or if they did, they remained in private hands, never made public despite their potential historical value. Despite suppression efforts, fragments of evidence survived in scattered records, personal accounts, and indigenous traditions that collectively painted a picture of who the Montana mountain giants were and why their existence was deemed so threatening that powerful interests sought to erase them from history. The most valuable surviving document was Thomas Wilson's personal diary, which his descendants preserved as a family heirloom. The diary contained daily entries describing the cave exploration, detailed measurements of the giant and various artifacts, and sketches of the most remarkable features. While skeptics could dismiss memories as unreliable, a contemporary diary written before the suppression began carried more evidential weight. Wilson's entries described the giant's skull in precise detail. The skull measures 60 centimeters from base to crown, far exceeding any normal human skull I have seen. The bone is thick and robust, the jaw massive and powerful. Most curious are the teeth. While they are clearly human teeth in general form, they are larger and show unusual wear patterns, suggesting a diet and chewing forces different from modern people. This description of teeth became significant when modern forensic anthropologists noted that different human populations show distinctive dental characteristics based on diet and genetic factors. The giants' teeth might have reflected their heavily carnivorous diet and possibly genetic differences from other human populations. Indigenous oral traditions provided crucial corroboration. The Crow people preserved stories about tall ones who lived in mountain caves, describing them as powerful but solitary, avoiding contact with other peoples. Blackfoot accounts spoke of ancient people of great size who had inhabited the mountains before current tribes arrived. These stories were typically dismissed as mythology, but their specific details matched the archaeological evidence from the Montana cave too closely to be mere coincidence. Most remarkably, petroglyphs found elsewhere in Montana showed giant footprints carved into rock faces, stylized but clear representations of feet far larger than normal human prints. While dating rock art is difficult, the weathering patterns and artistic style suggested considerable age. These carvings might have been created by the giants themselves as territorial markers, or by other peoples who'd encountered them and commemorated the meeting in stone. Comparative analysis with discoveries in Nevada provided additional context. The Nevada giants, while not identical, showed similar patterns: exceptional height, high-altitude dwelling, isolation from other peoples, and subsequent suppression of evidence. This pattern suggested not isolated anomalies, but a broader phenomenon. Multiple populations of unusually large people living in remote North American locations during prehistoric times. Mineral analysis of bone fragments eventually recovered from the collapsed cave site revealed chemical signatures consistent with long-term residence in the Montana region. The ratios of various elements absorbed from diet and environment confirmed the individual had lived his entire life in that area, not migrated from elsewhere. This suggested the giants were native to the region, not travelers or immigrants from distant lands. Trace element analysis also revealed elevated levels of certain minerals associated with high-altitude environments and meat-heavy diets. These findings supported the interpretation that the giants were physiologically adapted to their harsh environment through both genetics and lifestyle. The most tantalizing fragments were stories from descendants of the miners and Eastern investigators. Some families preserved accounts passed down as carefully guarded secrets. Stories about what had really been found, where some artifacts might have been hidden, and why the suppression had seemed so urgent to powerful institutions and individuals. These accounts suggested that the giant represented something deeply threatening to conventional historical narratives about human origins and population histories. Modern technology has enabled renewed efforts to locate the Montana mountain giant's cave and recover evidence that might survive, despite the 1890 suppression. Teams using drones equipped with LiDAR mapping have scanned mountainous areas near Billings, searching for geological anomalies consistent with cave systems that were artificially collapsed. In 2018, one scan identified a promising site, showing the signature of void spaces beneath collapsed rubble. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed the presence of cavities that might represent the cave's deeper chambers. While excavation permits have been difficult to obtain due to environmental regulations and landowner objections, limited surface collection recovered small bone fragments from the rubble. These fragments, though tiny, yielded enough material for modern DNA analysis. The results showed genetic markers associated with both Eurasian populations and Denisovan introgression, genetic contributions from an archaic human species that interbred with modern humans tens of thousands of years ago. This mixed ancestry suggested the Montana mountain giants represented a population with ancient genetic heritage that had evolved in isolation. The site shows anomalous magnetic properties, with compass needles behaving erratically in certain areas. Whether this magnetic peculiarity attracted the giants to the location or resulted from geological factors unrelated to human occupation remains unclear. Interviews with descendants of Thomas Wilson revealed family stories about artifacts he'd secretly kept, small items he'd hidden before the Eastern investigators arrived. These family treasures, if they exist, remain in private hands, their owners understandably reluctant to reveal them, given the historical pattern of suppression. DNA analysis conducted on recovered bone fragments provided scientific confirmation of the Montana mountain giants' existence and revealed their surprising genetic heritage. The genetic material, though degraded by time and environmental exposure, yielded usable sequences through advanced extraction and amplification techniques. The DNA showed a mixture of ancestry tracing to ancient Eurasian populations and significant Denisovan genetic contribution, far higher than typical modern humans. Denisovans were archaic humans who interbred with anatomically modern humans in Asia thousands of years ago. Most people today carry small percentages of Denisovan DNA, but the Montana giant showed proportions suggesting more recent admixture, or a population that had maintained higher archaic heritage through isolation. This genetic evidence suggested the giants weren't a different species, but rather an extreme variant of humanity, people who combined modern human genetics with higher than typical archaic ancestry, producing a population with unusual physical characteristics, including exceptional size. Their large size might have resulted from genetic variants affecting growth regulation, combined with high-altitude adaptation and diet. Living at elevation with unlimited access to protein and minimal competition could have selected for larger body size over generations. The final conclusion? The Montana mountain giants weren't mythological, but real people, whose genetic heritage, physical characteristics, and cultural achievements didn't fit comfortable historical narratives. Their erasure from history represented institutional preference for simple stories over complex truth. The mountains still hold their secrets, waiting for the day when humanity is ready to accept that the past is stranger and more diverse than we've been taught to believe.